Today is Wednesday, July 31st, 2024, and this is episode 274 of the Defensive Security Podcast. My name is Jerry Bell, and joining me tonight, as always, is Mr. Andrew Kalat.
Good evening, Jerry. How are you, my good sir?
So good it hurts. How are you?
I'm doing good. It's Wednesday, which is halfway through the week, so I can't complain too much.
It's just another day to me, though.
How are you enjoying your fun deployment?
It is awesome. Funny story. When my dad retired, he told me something sad. He said, one of the things that you don't realize is that the weekend starts losing its appeal.
Because every day's the weekend.
Because it's just another day. And holidays are just another day. There's not really something to look forward to. When you're working, you typically look forward to the weekend. It's just another day. I am finding that to be true. I'm going to be spending some time coming up down at the beach, which will be a whole different experience, not having to work and actually be at the beach, which will be cool.
So you don't have to wrap your laptop in plastic when you take it surfing with you anymore.
That is very true. No more conference calls while out on the boogie board.
I will say the random appearance of sharks behind you on your Zoom sessions will be missed.
Of course. Well, we'll have to find a way to bring that back.
I live in jealousy of your fun deployment. I will just say that. But not that you didn't work your ass off and earned it, right? This is 25 years of blood, sweat, and tears given to this industry to get you to this point. So you earned it.
Yeah, I'm going to have to be responsible again at some point, but I am having fun in the meantime.
As well you should.
Before we get into the stories for today, I just want to remind everybody that the thoughts and opinions we express on this show are ours and do not represent anybody else, including employers, cats, farm animals, spouses, children, etc., etc.
There's that one llama in Belarus, though, that agrees 100% with what we have to say.
Very true. Getting into the stories, we have one from Bleeping Computer, and this one is titled Over 3,000 GitHub Accounts Used by Malware Distribution Service. I thought this one was particularly interesting and notable. There is a malware distribution as a service that leverages both, let's call them fake or contrived GitHub accounts, as well as compromised WordPress sites. And what they're effectively leveraging is the brand reputation of GitHub. And so they have a fairly complicated setup of driving victims through watering hole attacks and SEO type lures to get people to these sites. And they have different templates that entice people to download these encrypted zip files that are hosted on GitHub. And what they're taking advantage of is two things. Number one, people generally think that GitHub is a reputable place to find files. And so, your level of concern goes down when you download something that you think is coming from a reputable place. And I think the other, perhaps more problematic angle, from my perspective at least, is GitHub is something that most companies allow access to. It is something that by design, many companies, not all, encourage their employees to interact with GitHub. And so you really can't block it, or at least it's more difficult to block it. And because it's one kind of amorphous thing, you don't have the ability to granularly say you can go to this aspect or this part of GitHub and not this other part of GitHub.
Yeah, I agree at all points. It's absolutely leveraging and abusing the reputation of GitHub to get this malware out there. And it's effective. Using WordPress doesn't surprise me. Just about every day I see some other plugin has a massive vulnerability. So I'm not blaming WordPress. I'm blaming their plugin ecosystem as being highly toxic. in the original
Yeah.
sense.
I know that WordPress has a lot of detractors, especially in the security community, but it's over 50% of the entire internet websites runs WordPress, right? That is pretty impressive.
There's something to be said for the amount of coverage or the amount of instances out there equals how many bad guys are poking at you. So if you're not widely deployed, you're probably also not getting widely tested. So there is absolutely some of that aspect of, hey, if you're a well used tool, you're likely to have more security problems. So statistically, that makes sense. But it's not a bad tool. Don't get me wrong. It's a super useful tool. It's just amazing how often I see advisories about really nasty exploits on various plugins for WordPress.
Uh, yeah, the barrier to entry for plugin development is incredibly low.
Mhm.
And there are just an absolute ton of them. There's many thousands. So it isn't surprising.
People who are running WordPress sites are not super technical admins. They're usually marketing folks or content generation folks. So when they're looking for, hey, I need something that makes a pretty picture do something like this in WordPress, they probably aren't looking at it with the same level of technical rigor you and I might.
That I will tell you in prior jobs where we had customers hosted on our infrastructure, this was a big problem because customers would walk away, right? It's so easy to set up. It's so easy to set up a WordPress instance, which is, by the way, like that's part of its value proposition, but it's also part of, I think it contributes to the low ongoing attachment or ongoing care and feeding of it. So easy
Mhm.
to set up and then just walk away from, and it's a big problem. I think that the WordPress team themselves have done a pretty good job of mitigating the issues to the extent they can. Most of it auto updates these days, but
Yeah.
more to go, right?
What's interesting to me is the way you describe that often sounds like the same problems we have with SaaS and cloud in general. It's so easy to set up and walk away from and not manage it well that we lead to all sorts of similar problems. This story is more about GitHub, and I agree with all your points. I just went down my WordPress rant rabbit hole, but yeah,
Yeah.
GitHub is an interesting one, and I don't have a lot of good solves for that one.
No, it is not a it's not an easily solvable issue. I think this is one of those cases where education will help. Certainly, proper endpoint detection, or I should say endpoint protection, will help. Being able to identify that somebody has downloaded and run something that is potentially malicious on their device. But beyond that, unless you're willing to take that leap and not not permit people to access GitHub, it's hard to defend against. And by the way, if the industry as a whole decided, hey, this is too risky, the bad guys would just move somewhere else.
Yeah, absolutely. They're leveraging whatever has a good solid reputation that has a sort of functionality. Not GitHub's fault. And I think you're right. If it wasn't GitHub, it'd be somebody else that serves the same function. It's they're a victim of their own success in that sense.
100%. So the next story we have comes from the Know Before blog. Know Before is, I think, a fairly well known security education company. They are not without controversy in my experience. I think they're the ones that offer the ransomware guarantee or warranty, if I'm not mistaken. But this story is not about that. This story is about how they hired a North Korean, allegedly, as a senior developer. And so they did what I would describe as a public service announcement describing how they had been duped by purportedly a North Korean government agent who was trying to infiltrate their company. It's a little unclear exactly what their mission was. But this story basically is that this company was trying to hire a senior developer. They went through the interview process. They selected what they believed was the best candidate. They performed all their normal interviews, background checks, and whatnot. Then they made an offer. The offer was accepted. They dispatched a laptop to this person, and then suddenly that laptop was observed attempting to install malware, And that is what really set off the series of events that alerted them to what was going on. So in the end analysis, the person they hired was, again, somebody allegedly from North Korea. They had used a stolen identity of a legitimate person in the US. They altered a photo, and it's a little unclear to me exactly in what ways, and they show a before and after of how the photo was altered, but it's not entirely clear to me if that was the photo of the person whose identity they stole or somebody else. That aspect isn't clear to me. The laptop was sent to what they call a laptop shipping mill, I think is what they call it. Basically, it's a place that will set these laptops up either on a network to allow remote access from overseas, or they will send them out. I think in this instance, it was allowing remote access in. So the bad actor was apparently in North Korea, VPNing into the laptop and then connecting from the laptop, which I guess was located in California, and accessing the company's networks. When security team identified that there was malicious activity going on, they tried to contact this, very new employee, and the new employee said, "I can't talk right now. I'm trying to debug something, but I've got a personal or family issue going on." And so over the course of a couple of hours, the security team decided to isolate the laptop, and then things started to fall apart, and they realized exactly what happened. It's not entirely clear to me, by the way, from reading the article, exactly how they stitched together that this person was a North Korean agent. That is not part of at least the stories that I have read. But it's interesting because this resonated with me personally. I worked for a large multinational company for a very long time,
And you're a North Korean agent.
and yes, that is true. Sorry, everybody had to find out that way. Anyhow,
Uh, didn't they all know? Is that breaking news?
it's not- I think it might be for some.
Oh, you're a very nice North Korean agent.
I try to be. Try
Yeah.
to.
Anyway. Yeah, it's a crazy story. I sent this to some of my friends in HR and they're like, "What? This happens?" Yeah, it happens. So that tells me there's some awareness. Interestingly, according to the timeline that KnowBe4 published, their SOC was on it. They detected the user's activity, suspicious activity began at 9:55 p.m. and by 10:20 p.m., so like 25 minutes later, they're like, "Nope, shutting you down."
Yeah, but
Like
by
this
all
is
accounts, they did a great job.
yeah. And the SOC person was suspicious enough, and also the North Korean angle looks like before reached out to the FBI and Mandiant, and so it's probably coming from one of those two, who are saying that this was a North Korean thing. Although from the story as well, it looks like this may not necessarily be malicious in terms of state-sponsored malicious activity, so much as it might have been just a way to earn legitimate money sent back to North Korea to fund whatever. As they say, at least according to what they quote in their blog post, the FBI was saying sometimes this is just straight up people working in sanctioned countries getting around the sanctions and doing legitimate work. But this guy immediately started loading malware, which is not great.
And
Uh,
realistically, if he hadn't started loading malware, who I don't know if it would have been very easy to detect this was going on.
sure. So a lot of lessons learned, though. A lot of takeaways.
Yeah, yeah. Anyway, I
Yeah.
was saying that
Oh,
this
sorry.
it hit home for me because I have had similar, not with foreign agents, North Korean agents or people in embargoed countries, but I have had experience with people falsifying who they are when they get hired, and it's difficult to do, especially in these remote working environments. I'm not saying that it can't also be done in a face-to-face type environment, but I think that it is easier to pull off in today's remote working environment. I'm still, by the way, a big proponent of remote working. Don't misunderstand in any way. But I do understand this one. I can definitely sympathize. Someday I will tell some funny stories about experiences I've had. So they did call out some tips and recommendations as a result of this. Again, this was intended to be a public service announcement, so they wanted to describe the the event and what they learned from it. So their tips to prevent were scan your remote devices and make sure no one remotes into these. So I think that was really addressing how the person was connecting remotely into the laptop. But by the way, that's not a even if you were to not permit VNC or remote desktop or things like that, it's not a guarantee because there are plenty of cheap ass network KVMs, right?
Sure.
So just
Yeah.
be aware of that. Next one is better vetting. Make sure the employee are physically where they are supposed to be. I think also that's a difficult one. Better resume scanning for career inconsistencies. By the way, I'm assuming they are listing these tips because some aspect of the root cause analysis is tied back to each of these things. So I'm guessing that if they had looked more closely, they would have identified inconsistencies in the career of the person whose identity they had stolen. And so I think what they're
Yeah.
saying is make sure that everything ties out. Then next one is get these people on video camera and ask them about the work they're doing so that you can see firsthand A, that their picture looks like who you think you're hiring, and B, that you can understand that they are in fact who they say they are. And I can definitely tell you firsthand that's an important one.
Yeah, but that's getting easier and easier to fake. And
Yeah,
that's going to be an interesting problem as
right.
AI technology is getting cheaper and more widely accessible.
So
So,
so Bob, our friend Bob, told me about a situation in a Asian country where it is, at least in the recent past, fairly common for what I'll loosely call, or what he loosely called, job fairs, where people who were job prospecting could go and hire an expert. Like they could, the person, this person would offer their services to go through interviews and
wow.
and purport to be the person who's looking for the job,
Hmm.
and they would rely on, like, the silly Westerners' inability to distinguish between different Asians, and they would end up hiring and bringing on board somebody who was not the person they had actually interviewed, and it was done at an industrial scale.
Obviously, that is a short lived scam for the person getting hired, but I guess they get a paycheck or two out of the deal and move on.
I think sometimes I think it can work out for a long time, unfortunately.
Guess, I guess that's true. Wow, that is crazy.
Anyway, the
Yeah.
laptop next one is the laptop shipping address is different from where they are supposed to live at work is a red flag. So I'm assuming that this person declared that they had an address in place A, and they asked for the laptop to be shipped to place B, and that should be definitely a red flag. I'm a little surprised that has to be called out. That seems obvious to me. They do have a couple of recommended process improvements, including, background checks appear to be inadequate and names are not consistent. So, basically, where the person's name and the results of their background check don't necessarily line up correctly, you need to make sure that you're properly vetting your references and do not solely rely on email-based references. I think that's also a good thing, although not airtight, especially if you're trying to fend off any type of, I wanna say nation state, but advanced adversary. It's a kind of a low bar to top.
If they're already a scammer, they can probably get over that hurdle of having three valid references who will lie for them.
That's my thinking too.
Yeah.
Implement enhanced monitoring for any continued attempts to access systems. That makes very good sense. Obviously, if if you terminate this, by the way, I don't think is unique to the situation. When you terminate someone, you need to make sure that their access is terminated globally and you don't have backdoor ways into your environment. Review and strengthen access controls and authentication processes. And then finally, conduct security awareness training. And then they have a couple of what to look out for
Yeah.
is like using voice over IP numbers, discrepancies in addresses and dates of birth, conflicting personal information like marital status, and then also family emergencies. I think, again, when the company's SOC tried to contact the employee and ask what was going on, this person said, "Oh, I can't talk. I've got a family emergency going on." And then sophisticated use of VPNs and VMs for accessing custom or for company systems. I think that's, by the way, a very important one and something that I know Bob was doing pretty pervasively was looking for evidence of unauthorized, connections from known VPN sources
Right.
and then attempting to execute malware and subsequent cover-ups. So I think all really good. I will also say, by the way, that I think obviously KnowBe4 published this to get their name out. It was intended to help. I put that one judge called corporate puffery. Which is my new favorite term. It's the legal term now. But which it was shared far and wide. But it was very clear because this company had to post a follow-up blog post that this post was being interpreted as they're disclosing a data breach. I thought that angle is also very interesting that you have to be careful how you couch things. And they in the
Right.
FAQ, by the way, they actually draw a delineation between how the InfoSec media industry covered their disclosure or their public service announcement and how the general media disclosed it. The InfoSec press, as they describe it, covered it as a lessons learned. Here's some things to look out for, and did what they had hoped. But the general media basically just covered it as if it was just another data breach, which I thought was
Yeah.
quite interesting and something to be aware of.
There's two other things that I took away. Interesting that one, their EDR software caught the malware. So that's important.
Mm.
I don't know if it was CrowdStrike, but we'll just mention that just for the search algorithms because everybody has to talk about CrowdStrike. The other thing that I thought was interesting is that the way this is written, it's clearly a bit of an internal document, the way that the verbiage is used and the tenses and that sort of thing. So uh, they say here, let me find it really quick. I don't have to, it's good we have new employees in a highly restricted area when they start. And they have no access to production systems. So it sounds to me, based on that they have some sort of tiering for brand new employees that they don't automatically get access to anything, that they're some sort of training period or ramp up period where they're vetted or whatnot, whatever the purpose is for that particular sort of sandbox that they're left in initially. Not a bad idea
That's
for this
that's a
sort of
gr
circumstance.
it's a great idea and a great call out. Yeah.
Crazy story though. I'm really glad that before published all this and we can learn from it. Kudos to them. Yeah, you're right. There's probably some cynical, self-serving nature to it, but nonetheless, it's good fodder for us.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it's happening probably a lot more than we want to admit. Moving on to the next story. This one comes from Ars Technica, and the title is "Secure Boot is completely broken on 200 plus models from 5 big device makers." So I think most people hopefully know what Secure Boot is. It's intended to establish a level of trust in the firmware that is running on the hardware, and that was back in the early 2000 late, aughts, early 2010s, a big deal because there were some pretty novel firmware-based attacks and the specter of really persistent and very difficult to eradicate firmware level malware was running pretty rampant. So the industry created this secure boot concept, and it relies on public key cryptography, and the one thing that everybody should realize by now is that we really suck. And so there are 2 distinct problems here that's identified in the article. One is that back in 2022, one of the signing keys from AMI was posted on a public GitHub repository. Now, it was encrypted. It was strongly encrypted with a 4-character password. So it was very easy to decompose, reverse engineer.
Indeed.
Yeah. So that basically means that systems which use secure boot that relies on that particular key can be bypassed by an adversary. They can now load malware. They can basically sign a malicious version of firmware and run that on the system. So not immune,
It'll be trusted.
and it'll be
Yeah. And the other way to fix this is basically to deploy firmware updates to the hardware to rotate the key, which is not
correct.
going to happen.
Correct. And
Yeah.
by the way, once a system is infected, like if you have malicious firmware, it is very difficult. This is not like you can necessarily just wipe the hard drive and start over. It's very difficult to eradicate. The tools and detection capabilities for malicious firmware are very immature.
Mhm. This
Oh,
is a tough one. When you're relying purely on the secrecy of a key, and if that key were to get leaked in this case, it blows up that entire ecosystem. Uh, wow, that's rough. And the other thing that I'll bring up is I have seen so many secrets get pushed to GitHub by accident. It's so easy to do. And it's a huge problem that I don't know that we talk about enough. Once it's pushed too, it's almost impossible to ever wipe from that record because it's permanently in that repo's history. So once that happens, you're basically forced to rotate that secret. And in this case, you can't because it's relying on firmware you can't centrally update uh, without massive amounts of effort. So now you've got this problem forever
yeah, correct. Now,
for that, for those hardware.
in this instance, and the other instance, which is maybe a little less bad, I guess in some ways it's less bad, in other ways it's worse. What we just talked about affected 200 or so models. There were another 300 models that were impacted by a different problem. And that other problem was that one of the firmware manufacturers released prototype code that had a stock key in it. And in fact, the common name in this key is do not trust. So the hardware manufacturers
Perfect.
did not actually rotate the key as they were supposed to. And so in the analysis of the first problem that we were just talking about, this company called Binarly was doing some analysis of other systems, looking for other problems, and they found apparently a very pervasive problem across many different models of hardware that have this stock test key instead of an actual legitimate key. And so it's literally the same key used everywhere. It was never intended to be used in production systems, but apparently the hardware manufacturers didn't get the memo. I guess the one good news in all of this is that I think all of the hardware now is, or almost all of it is out of support and probably pretty old. Not necessarily a good look in terms of our ability. Like these, who knows how many people have had these keys over the years and provided an opportunity for bad actors to leverage the vulnerability. I would say for most people, or for most organizations, it's not like an exigent threat because something else has to go horribly wrong. In order for a bad person, unless you're talking about like a laptop or a desktop personal, PC, from a server perspective, something else has to go horribly wrong. You've be compromised. And if they did, this provides a really gnarly method of persistence. If that were to be properly leveraged. But the one, and again, coming from where I was, there is a category of company that has to worry about this like very deeply, and that is cloud
Yeah,
providers.
that's true. somewhere there is hardware backing all that stuff up.
Yeah, and because
It
you have to have administrative rights on the system in
Sure.
order to flash it. If you are like, I run infosec.exchange, and I have a bunch of bare metal servers that I rent from a data center. I have root. I could conceivably update the firmware on those.
You
Now,
could.
if I updated the firmware in a way that maintained persistence and my hosting provider was not sophisticated, I could establish a means of persistence to compromise the next person who or organization that is using that piece of hardware.
You rent it, you flash it with your code, you unrent it, and they rent it to somebody else.
Yes.
It doesn't matter if they loaded fresh OS or whatever, it's sitting there in firmware, it's at the BIOS level.
Yeah, exactly. So those are the
I mean,
kinds of things that kept me up at night.
but to your point, I don't know how much of a real world hardcore threat this is. It's a very interesting situation, but I don't think it's what's gonna burn most companies.
No, I think so you touched on something I wanted to hammer home, and that is our just terrible stewardship of keys,
Yeah.
particularly as it pertains to GitHub. I'm sure there are others, but like GitHub is, I suspect, if in 50 years going to be viewed as like the nexus point for many data breaches that were caused by leaked keys.
It's just too easy.
It's an
It's
epidemic.
and and I'm not throwing shade at the developers. It is just so easy to do it that even the most well-intentioned and diligent developer can get caught by this. And even if you have tools that are supposed to check for secrets before that PR request is completed, they're not foolproof. And the secrets look differently and they're not great at, there's no one perfect tool for this. So I don't know. The only thing I can say, and it's really tough when we're talking about firmware based things, but everything else is try its design with the intent that you've got to rotate those keys on a regular basis and make it easier for yourself. Much easier said than done.
Certainly true. I will say if you start out with that design principle in mind, it's easier. It's much
Mhm.
easier than going back and trying to retrofit.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
and I think, I think that goes without saying, but it is doubly true in this instance. So keep an eye on those keys and definitely rotate them when and where you can. Minimally know what keys you have and how you would rotate them if they were
Mhm.
disclosed.
And I don't want to get down in the weeds of all the coding practices, but because I'm certainly not an expert there. However, what I, as a very dangerous level of knowledge that I have, just enough to be very dangerous, I understand there are ways to not directly call those secrets in your code, like you
Mhm.
or contain them in the code. You can call them as a reference in other ways. Teach your devs how to do that so that if they don't have to worry about that secret accidentally getting pushed. It is one very crude example of a very complicated problem that I'm not doing a good job talking about. But for those who know much better than I, try to help your devs not put secrets in GitHub, please. Thank you.
It's it is a difficult, and I will tell you, I wrestled with this problem mightily. It requires you to create an ecosystem. And one of the challenges I've observed is that we are, how best to say it, commoditizing development. I know that's perhaps a crass way of saying it, but we're putting people in development roles that don't really have a lot of development background, and we're basically throwing them out of the nest and saying, "Okay, it's time to fly." And they know how to write code, but they don't necessarily know they're not even aware that this class of problem exists until somebody from the security team comes along and says, "What did you do?" Let alone knowing how and where to actually store the keys. And so very incumbent on the leadership of the security team to make sure that ecosystem both exists and your developers are aware of how to use it. Otherwise, this
So
is gonna keep happening.
a single slide during onboarding isn't good enough?
So add that slide to your annual training and you're good.
All right. And maybe just something like just don't share secrets. Just as a bullet point, move on. I think you're
So
good.
yeah,
I think
don't share secrets, right? Don't share your passwords.
yeah.
That's right. I have, by the way, I have, by the way, been involved in situations where something like this has happened, and I have asked the person, like, at what point did you think it was okay that this is a password? And he said, no, it's not a password. It's a secret.
Right.
Not allowed to share passwords. There's no prohibition on secrets. So
This
be
makes my code go. I need it. It's important.
very, very cautious about terminology. All right, let's keep plugging along here. The next one comes from Dark Reading, and the title is CrowdStrike outage losses estimated as staggering $5.4 billion.
And I'm going to go on record and say that's probably low.
Yeah, it was funny in the immediate aftermath of the event, or maybe a couple days after, somebody was asking the question of how much money that was lost, and at the time, the number we'd just gotten the number of 8.5 million systems impacted, and so I did a bit of back of the napkin math, and I came up with between $5 and $10 billion, which is pretty interesting that it's coming out to be 5.4 billion. I do think that, by the way, the 8.5 million number is now being walked back. I haven't heard a new number, but Microsoft seems to be
Right.
signaling that 8.5 million is probably very conservative, and CrowdStrike doesn't
Yeah.
seem to be very
Yep.
motivated to go correct the record.
Yeah. From what I understand, those were just the systems that were able to send a crash dump to Microsoft, is what they based it on. And they're now saying that was probably just a subset of some.
Yeah,
So that 8.5 billion number that we've been talking about is probably way low.
yeah.
I'm just going to take a guess. It's at least 10x that number.
It's a lot. It's a lot.
Yeah.
It was an interesting discontinuity because I think CrowdStrike has something like 15% of market share, and this was like 1% or less than 1% of Windows systems that were impacted, and it was hard to reconcile those. Now I what the only thing I could think of is that 1% included home users, but I don't know, it doesn't seem right. It'll be very interesting to see what the actual number is. I think it's certainly gonna be a lot higher than 8.5 million just based on the news coverage. How many freaking airports did we see pictures of people on ladders hitting the displays? It's
Yep.
mind-boggling the amount of effort that went into recovering from this. I
Side story, I saw this amazing article. I won't do it justice because I didn't have it prepped, but somebody figured out they could use a barcode scanner to speed up the process because Windows treats a barcode scanner as a keyboard. And they figured out how to encode the actual command with uh, the
the
encryption key they
the
needed. Uh,
BitLocker key, yeah.
thank you, the BitLocker key, and created custom barcodes for each PC that was tied to it. And instead of typing it all in, just got to the point where they needed, they scanned the barcode and boom, it was recovered. And I was like, I need to go find the story. It was an amazing little bit of a hack that I thought was awesome.
Yeah,
Also,
there
I
was a
was
c
thinking,
I was gonna say it was a company in Australia that did that, I think, if memory serves.
uh,
Yeah, that was very clever.
I was also thinking randomly when I saw that same picture of those people up in the ladder fixing that airport monitor. I'm like, if you're down to that monitor, you probably got your critical stuff back.
That is
Maybe
very true. Although different teams, probably different teams.
that's true. That's true. And I know there's a lot more to talk about here, but one last thing I'll say, just since I stole we'll probably get a lot better read on this because a whole bunch of legal actions is starting to spin up and that'll all come out in discovery.
Yeah, Delta Airlines, notably, we were sharing some stories back and forth about Delta Airlines before the recording here, announced that they estimate their losses at $500 million, and they have retained legal counsel, and they're contemplating legal action against both CrowdStrike and Microsoft.
Yeah.
So
Uh, the other interesting thing since the last we talked about this thing came up, we were take this with a bit of a grain of salt, but we were talking a lot about why CrowdStrike was operating in the kernel and that if that was a good idea or not, and why are they allowed to do it, and should they be allowed to do it, et cetera, et cetera. And you can't do that on a Mac. It's one thing Microsoft came out and said is that based on an EU legal finding, they were forced due to antitrust type considerations to basically allow any security tool to have the same level of access as Microsoft's built-in security tools. Hence, they didn't want Microsoft to have monopoly access to the operating system, so they needed to allow third parties to have the same capabilities. So if Microsoft Defender has the kernel, therefore competitors need to also be able to have kernel access. That's going to be an interesting thing to see play out. And I think Microsoft is walking a very careful line of pointing that out without playing too much of a victim, but it is an interesting caveat that I think adds to the nuance of the conversation we were having last week on this topic.
yeah, they've come out pretty forcefully and said that they're intending to refactor access to the kernel. And I think they actually made the comment that they are intending to move in a direction that's much more like iOS, the Apple iOS ecosystem. So that'll be quite interesting to watch.
Yeah, I don't blame them. Microsoft's in a tough spot here, I think. Yeah, and I'm not a Microsoft lover or apologist, but they've caught a lot of flack for something that kind of wasn't their direct fault, but somewhat the result of decisions and ecosystems and permissions that were granted. And I think they realize now that they just can't cede that ground or that they're still going to be held accountable to what other people are doing in their operating system.
Yeah, I
But
in the legal circles, there's this concept of an attractive nuisance, and I have a feeling that's gonna be part of the basis of their of claims against Microsoft is that should have known that, and therefore they're somewhat culpable for not taking action. And anybody who, who's had somebody slip and fall on their driveway, at least in the US, I don't know that this is a big problem outside of the US. You have that sort of problem, right? It's an attractive nuisance. You should have done something about it. You should have known that this was gonna be a problem. Somebody got hurt as a result, and now you're at least in part responsible. So, again, don't know, not presupposing what a court would find. I don't think this, by the way, is the kind of thing that would actually end up going to trial. But hey, we'll see. This, by the way, this whole story here is based on a report that comes from a company called Parametrics. And they are I guess, a think tank, provides information to insurance companies. And so it was they who pinned the estimated losses at half a billion, sorry, at $5.4 billion. They identified that healthcare companies were the most impacted, followed by banking as well as transportation companies. We actually have a breakdown based on their telemetry they have. They've they've identified different categories and how much each category of industry lost as a result of this, and that all totals up to the $5.4 billion. There were some interesting, conclusions at the end of the report, which was linked in the article from Dark Reading, and I'll just read through those. And some of them, by the way, are a little contrary to what I understood to be the case. So the first one is that recovery disparities between cloud and traditional infrastructures. They point out that cloud-based, organizations that had their assets impacted in the cloud recovered much more quickly than those who had traditional infrastructure. And on the one hand, I know that there were a lot of problems, but on the other hand, I'm wondering if that whole concept is skewed by the fact that you don't have laptops and kiosks and whatnot sitting in the cloud, and so those things that were impacted actually required you to dispatch someone to go out and do, whereas, with infrastructure that's sitting in the cloud, like, somebody from their basement was able to just plug through them one by one without having to to actually dispatch people to go fix. So I don't know how much that played into it.
I had one other thought there, which is that maybe a certain number of these systems that went down were abstracted in some sort of hypervisor, and the management plane was still remotely available to SOC or knock engineers who could fix it without actually having to put hands on physical keyboards at the
Mm,
devices.
that's possible. Very
I
possible.
don't know, but because I'm assuming like the underlying infrastructure running it didn't go down. It was
Right.
the actual virtual machines inside of it that were running CrowdStrike at that layer that caused the blue screen. And I don't know. I don't know if I can fix that easier than having to go plug into a USB port, physical device.
I think they were able, if nothing else, they were able to use a virtual KVM to connect to the
Yeah.
systems.
So that's much quicker, I would think.
Yeah.
I would
That'd be
hope.
my expectation. So their second conclusion was misplaced priorities. They they call out the focus on non-systemic cyber uh, perils was ultimately a catalyst for the CrowdStrike outage. But my read of that is that we're all focused on things like ransomware and worms and whatnot. We weren't focused on the potential impacts of other components in our technology stack failing catastrophically.
Yeah. I
We
challenge this. I think that's some Monday morning quarterbacking.
keep in mind that I don't think you can I don't think you can divorce that one from the next item, which is achieving portfolio diversification. So keep in mind that this was written for insurance companies,
That's
right?
fair. Carry on.
Not not necessarily for IT companies. I so what they're pointing out here is that there was a concentration of risk based on pervasive use of CrowdStrike and pervasive use of Windows. The intersection of pervasive use of CrowdStrike and Windows led to this very systemic outage. And so if you are an insurance company, you should probably be thinking just like how insurance companies don't want to have all of their customers in Florida because that then if a hurricane comes through, all of their customers at the same time are making simultaneous claims. They want to have diversified customer base. They want to have some people in Alabama and some people in New York and some people in Ohio and some
That's fair.
in
Yeah.
Florida. And so carrying that concept into IT. And so you don't do you wanna insure or do you wanna have companies under your insurance umbrella who are only using Windows and only using Windows and CrowdStrike? Because now this is pointing out that creates a situation that is not unlike having all of your homeowners sitting in Florida. It's been a very one-sided.
I'm also very curious how these lawsuits are going to go, if they do indeed go. As we have very cynically observed over the years, the EULAs that these companies write are not really setting themselves up for a lot of liability. And I saw a quote from the CEO of Delta, and I won't get it right, but basically he was saying, hey, they got to be held accountable and we need to hold them accountable. And my initial thought, having been about a lot of discussions around procurement, is probably something your legal team should have done when you signed that contract. What did your legal team agree to? And do they really have any actual liability in this circumstance? And my gut, I've never read the EULA for CrowdStrike. I've never bought CrowdStrike, so I don't know. But having looked at many other EULAs, they have this limited liability stuff. And hey, yeah, we might screw up. This stuff isn't perfect. And this is how much we're liable for. So it will be very interesting, I think, how that might play out in the real world.
Yeah, I've seen snippets of CrowdStrike's EULA and contract, and one of the in the immediate aftermath, one of the notable discussion points was that CrowdStrike does not permit you, the customer, to use CrowdStrike in a I'm paraphrasing, but in a context of life critical or safety critical uses, and I think there were some other
Hmm.
similar words. It is not uncommon, by the way, for software companies to limit the liability based on how much you paid. Like, you can't necessarily sue them for damages that exceed the amount that you paid them. That is a fairly common thing. Now, the one reality is, as was stated by the CEO of Delta, they are gonna go after Delta, and it will be sorry, after CrowdStrike, and it will be interesting to see how that is perceived by the court. I will tell you, you at least in the US, again, my context is all US law, you can't disclaim away, you can't write away in contract gross negligence, right? That is something that if you are found to be gross negligent, it doesn't matter what you wrote in what the customer agreed to in a contract, that there can still be a finding against you. And so I think that's very likely the stance or the angle that Delta will take, and probably some other companies as well. I think it'll be very interesting to see how this plays out because, again, I'm not an attorney. I have worked with quite a few of them over the years, and I've seen a lot of contract cases go to court and be settled out of court. I think personally, this is the kind of thing that would get settled out of court because CrowdStrike is not going to want um, drawn out legal proceeding that is really giving them a deep their IT processes and development processes a deep examination. And likewise, Delta probably doesn't want a deep examination of exactly how they were using CrowdStrike and whether that was in concert with the terms of their license agreement and whatnot. The I think the challenge for CrowdStrike is I I'm not saying this isn't warranted, but, there are a lot of companies right now that are probably in talks with legal counsel on what their options are, and I think once one happens, this is gonna quickly turn into either a class action case or it's gonna turn into some revolving door of litigation. And the reality is, I think unless CrowdStrike goes to trial with this and they're found to be not having been negligent and their contract term limitations are enforceable, they stand a lot to lose.
Yeah, that's true. The one thing that you touched on that I thought was interesting is the EULA bit of not to be used in critical infrastructure, life
Mhm.
infrastructure. And the one other area that I have any sort of familiarity with is aviation software, which is meant obviously to run aircraft and important functions on aircraft. And that software is incredibly expensive and very highly regulated because it is meant for that critical use case. So what that sort of tells me is that we have this tension going on here of we want in a relatively inexpensive software, almost commodity grade that can run everywhere to solve this problem. But that inexpensive software means that the level of care that what goes into very high critical software. I'm not explaining this well, but if you look at why it costs so much money to write aviation software is because the level of diligence is so high because the consequence of failure is so high, as well as all the regulatory oversight and that sort of thing comes into it. We don't have that in this case, which is probably why we have that EULA stipulation of don't run it in a critical case. But if you're expecting that level of due care and carefulness in coding, it comes with that price. And would corporations be willing to pay that price? Instead of paying $150 a node or whatever it is for CrowdStrike, are they willing to pay $5,000 a node? That's where the rubber meets the road.
If you look at the case of Delta, obviously they're an airline and they have planes that are the software that runs on them are life critical, but I don't think that's what the things that failed, I think, were the kind of the back office stuff, the planning and the scheduling of crews and departures and arrivals and whatnot, things that are not necessarily important to an airplane staying up in the air, but rather to orchestrating the movement of planes around the world and passengers around the world, and that is not by itself, I think, a life critical thing, although in aggregate, there was certainly a a story about a person in Florida, an elderly person in Florida who missed his flight as a result of this and has not been seen since.
Yeah, and I'm sure that there's second order. What I'm trying to draw a parallel between is if you're demanding software with zero defects, it's much, much more expensive.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And that's where I'm going with this is there's whether we like it or not, there are trade-offs. And so if you look at one of the extreme of software that runs, and I only say this because this is what I'm familiar with. I'm sure the same for like power plants and such. Software that runs super critical stuff is also super expensive. So if
Mhm.
you want that level of dependability, you probably aren't going to do it on commodity multifunction operating systems and hardware. And you're probably not going to do it with lower cost tooling like this. So I guess what I'm trying to say is if companies expect zero defect, they're going to have to pay for it. And we're not in that scenario right now.
Temper your expectations, I think is what
Yeah. And you
you're
can't have fast, cheap, reliable, pick one kind of situation.
yeah, it's fair. I think in this instance, this is one of those situations where it's obvious in hindsight. It's a simple failure. It's a stupid failure. It didn't rely on highly sophisticated quality assurance processes in order to catch it. But it's one of those things where it's obvious in hindsight. It's not necessarily obvious going in. And so I think broadly speaking, you're right. We in IT and really civilization and society in general have built this infrastructure around software and systems that we beat the shit out of our vendors, pardon my French, to get the lowest prices out of. And then things happen and we are
And
super
generally, you might say it's worked. Like how much,
it has worked.
right?
This works spectacularly well. Like,
And
we don't how many times do we have this discussion? This is not a common problem. On the other side, I'll just contrast that with every single month, Microsoft, and I think Oracle does it quarterly and many other companies do too, release a cadre of patches for critical vulnerabilities. So
mhm.
I think to some extent, on the one hand, we've built an ecosystem that is tolerant of a certain level of software badness or lack of quality. But on the other hand, when things like this come along, it highlights how interconnected and interdependent our systems are, and that we're not necessarily that the things that we're buying are not as resilient as they need to be based and have the expectation that they would never fail.
And not on the commodity multifunctional hardware and software we're using for sure.
Yeah. All right. It was not obvious to hopefully with through the magic of editing, not obvious that we had like catastrophic connectivity failure or whatnot. But I think we're going to cut it off and we'll pick up the rest of the stories next time.
Sounds good.
Uh, I appreciate everybody's time and attention, and I hope you learned something and certainly appreciate your patronage here. So you can follow our podcast here at our website at www.defensivesecurity.org. You can find back episodes just about any podcast service, including now, thanks to Mr. Kalat, including YouTube
Audio only for the moment.
or
Just
audio
an
only.
experiment. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, we'll be experimenting with video, but we both unfortunately have to undergo some plastic surgery things before we can do that.
About
So,
a 12-month intensive workout program with the world's leading exercise physiologists, I believe, as well.
yes, but that's to look forward to in the future. You can follow me on social media. I'm primarily on my Mastodon instance, infosec.exchange. You can follow me at Jerry at infosec.exchange. You can follow Andy where?
On X at Lerg, L-E-R-G, and infosec.exchange at L-E-R-G.
Awesome. And with that, I wish everybody a great week. I hope you have a great weekend ahead, and we will talk again very soon. Thank you all.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.